Welcome to the material blending tutorial for Blender, and in here we're going to set up a shader that allows you to blend between different materials using vertex painting and a height map. So this is exactly the same behavior that you can get in a game engine when you feed it an object and then use vertex colors to blend between different materials on the object. So it's actually great to be able to preview that in real time in Blender, because it really allows you to fine-tune the look and feel of your object directly in your modeling application. In the tutorial, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the shader editor and how to set up your materials, set up your nodes, and then preview it either using Evee or Cycles in the viewport. So let's get started. So the first thing that we want to do is actually enable the Node Wrangler add-on, because it makes working in the shader editor much quicker and much easier, and it contains a bunch of useful shortcuts. So go to Edit Preferences and then navigate to the Add-ons category, and in here just type in Node Wrangler and then make sure that this add-on is enabled and has a checkbox in front of it. Once you have done that, we can actually get started. Okay, so right now our viewport has the 3D view up here and the animation editor down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this up and then down here, switch this to the shader editor. So just click up here and then go to the shader editor. And as you can see, it shows you the material of the cube that's in your scene. So up here you can see slot 1 and then material, which means that this object has the material with the name material assigned to it. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete the object, and then I'm going to add a new plane. So Shift A to add an object, then go to Mesh, and then go to Plane. And then what we want to do is subdivide this a little bit. So I'm going to go into Edit mode, and I'm going to go to Edge mode, and then I'm going to press Ctrl R to add subdivisions. And then I'm going to use my mouse wheel and scroll up until we have 10 cuts. And then I'm going to do left mouse button to confirm and right mouse button to confirm again. Then we're going to do the same thing on the other axis. Ctrl R, scroll your mouse wheel until we have 10 cuts, left mouse button, right mouse button. And now that we have done that, we have a nice plane that has a bunch of subdivisions. As you can see, this thing doesn't have a material applied yet. And what we can do is we can actually create a new material if we wanted to by just pressing on New. And now you can see it has created a material called material 001. And for now, that's fine, but let's rename that, and let's actually rename that to blend underscore material. And then once I do that, you can see the name change, and you can see the name change up here as well. So that's our basic material setup. And next we're going to bring in some textures that we're going to use to blend between. So before we load Quixel Bridge to bring a material into Blender, one thing we need to make sure is that our render engine is set to Cycles. So go to your render properties, and then up here you can change the render engine from Evee to Cycles. So left click on it, change it to Cycles. Cycles is a path traced renderer that supports displacement maps. Evee is more like a game engine and doesn't support displacement maps by default. So if we don't set it to Cycles, Quixel Bridge will actually not export your displacement maps. And since we need the displacement map to blend between layer 1 and layer 2 of the material, we need to make sure to set our render engine to Cycles. Also, I like to set the feature set to experimental, and I like to set the device to GPU compute, which means it's going to use my GPU to render the viewport. Now that all of that is adjusted, you can load the Quixel Bridge software. So here it is. You can download the software from the Quixel website if you don't have it yet. And then once you've installed it, just go to Edit and Settings and change the DCC engine to Blender. Quick thing about the UI, you can see various different materials. What we want to do is we want to actually download a ground texture. So let's just type in ground to look for actual ground materials. And then you can see, I think these two look pretty promising. Blending between these two materials should be fun. So those are the materials we're going to use. If you haven't downloaded a material or an asset yet, you will see it's being displayed on a gray background. So this one I haven't downloaded, and this one I haven't downloaded, for example. If I hover over it, I can click on the download icon in the upper right corner. And once I do that, it will download it. Once it's downloaded, it will show up with a blue checkbox, which means it's now in your local library, and then you can click the export button to actually export it. So what you want to do is you want to hover over the rocky dirt material and download it by clicking the download icon in the upper right corner. You can see I've already done it, so I'm just going to left click. And then in here you have the asset info that describes the material. You can go to your download settings, make sure that albedo, displacement, normal, AO, and roughness is enabled. In the export settings, you can specify the texture resolution that's going to be used to export it to Blender and the texture format. I'm going to set it to 4K and TGA, and then I want it to export to Blender. Once I'm happy with that, I'm just going to click export, and then it's going to take a second to actually export to Blender. And then we can go here, and as you can see, nothing has really changed, and that's because our plane still has the blend material assigned. Now we can switch to the new material by clicking in here and selecting the dry rocky ground material, or we can go down here to the material properties tab and switch between blend and the rocky ground material. With that, let's take a closer look at the shader editor and see what's going on in there. So to be able to see the texture in the viewport, let's switch to the material preview viewport shading. So left click on that to enable it. And then you can see we can now see the texture on our object. And I also want to turn off the wireframe on the object. So select it and then just click here and turn off wireframe, or use whatever hotkey you have assigned to it. And then down here we have the shader editor. So let's take a look at that. The orange boxes are our textures that we have brought in. And then essentially what's going on is we're specifying the UV coordinates that are being used here. And then here are our different texture maps. Here are some nodes that do some changes to the texture maps. And then here's the principal BSDF shader that gets fed the albedo, ambient occlusion, roughness, and normal maps. And then we have the material output that gets fed the displacement information from the displacement map down here. Now, what we actually want to do is we want to take a look at these nodes and see what they do. So the ambient occlusion down here and the albedo map are being multiplied with one another. So you can see layer 1 is the albedo map, layer 2 is the ambient occlusion map, and the ambient occlusion map is being blended with the blending mode multiply with a factor of 0.5. So if I change this by left clicking and dragging the mouse, you can see that the intensity of the ambient occlusion changes in the viewport. So I can go from 0 all the way up to 1. If I hold down Shift, it becomes more sensitive when moving the mouse. If I hold down Control, it snaps to 0.1 increments. We want to make sure to leave this at 0.5 for now. And then the result of that multiplied node gets fed into the base color slot of the shader. The roughness map gets fed directly into the roughness slot. And the normal map gets fed into a normal map node where you can specify what tangent space to use, and you can change the strength of the normal map. So if I go down here and I change this to 0, you can see the normal map is not being used at all. I can change it to 0.25, and then you can see it starts coming in. I can change it to 0.75, it becomes more intense. I can change it to 1 for its full effect. We want to leave that as 1 as well for the best results. And then down here is our displacement map. The displacement map gets fed into a separate RGB node, which then gets fed into the displacement node. And then here you can specify the intensity of the displacement and the mid-level, and that gets then fed into the material output slot. Now, right now we can't see any displacement in the viewport because we are in material preview mode. If we change this to rendered mode, we should get a little bit of displacement on the object. And there you go, you can see we're getting some displacement on the object. If I turn on my wireframe again, you can see the original wireframe is still down here. And that's the displacement that we're getting through the shader. Now, because we do not have enough resolution in our mesh, we're actually not getting a ton of displacement yet. So what we want to do is we want to select the mesh and then go to modifiers, so modifier properties. And we're going to add a modifier, and we are going to add a subdivide modifier, so subdivision surface. We're going to set this to simple, and we're going to set the viewport levels to 2, which will increase the density of our mesh in the viewport. Let's actually crank it up to 3. And then you can see with every change that we make, the displacement becomes more and more realistic. So right now, we have more points to work with. So the displacement actually becomes more interesting. To change the scale of the displacement, we can use the slider. So if we crank it up to, let's say 1, we get like a super intense result, which we probably don't want. If we change it to 0.5, we get a less intense result. And for now, I'm just going to leave this at 0.1. The mid-level just changes where the midpoint, where the displacement map is being applied to, is located. And I'm going to leave that at 0 as well. So that's the basics for controlling the shader. Here we can specify the texture coordinates that are being used. And since we do not want to do any changes to the texture coordinates yet, I'm not going to get into that, but we're still going to leave them in here. Since we do want to blend between two different materials, we need to bring in a second set of textures into Blender. So let's go back to Quixel Bridge, type in ground up here again, and we're going to use the dry mud floor 2x2 meters. So download it. Once it's downloaded, click the export button, and that will bring it to Blender. So give it a second to do that. And then in here, you can see we now can switch between the dry rocky ground and the dry mud floor. So if I do that, you can see that my shader graph changes and the assignment to the object changes. Before we move forward, let's actually get rid of that subdivision modifier and switch our render engine back to Evee, because this is a little bit faster and will allow us to see results a little bit quicker. So let's change the plane material to the rocky ground material, because we've already organized our shader graph in here a little bit better. There's also snapping in here, by the way, so you can turn this on, and then you can turn this to like node X and Y, for example. And then once you drag the nodes, it will actually snap to the left or to the right or to the top or the bottom. So you can also use G to move and then press X to constrain to the X-axis, Y to constrain to the Y-axis. So all your 3D viewport hotkeys work in here as well. Let's turn snapping back off and let's actually bring in that second set of textures. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a duplicate of this shader. So select everything but the material output by left clicking and dragging, and then left click on the principled BSDF and move it a little bit, and then make sure you're hovering over the principled BSDF and press Ctrl C to copy. And then we want to do Ctrl V to paste, and it will paste the duplicate of the selected nodes in place. So Ctrl V, and here's our duplicate. And then I'm going to left click on this and move it down. And then you can see here is our second principled BSDF shader. Now, in order to have this rendered in the viewport, we need to plug it into the material output. So let's go in here and let's actually move this down. And what we're going to do, the first thing we want to do is actually get rid of that displacement. So just left click on the displacement input here, drag it to the left and just let go of the left mouse button. And then we're going to left click on the BSDF of the copy of our shader and drag that into the surface slot. So now this shader is being rendered into the viewport. Now obviously this is using the exact same inputs as the first shader, so it's showing you the same image in the viewport. So we need to change that. To change the texture, just click here, and then you can see that our texture for this material is called UHOMJ. And we want to switch it to UG4OC, which is that first material here, which is going to be the second material that we brought in. So let's click on that and just go through and change all of the textures accordingly. So this is the roughness texture. So let's change to the roughness texture. This is the normal texture. Let's change to the normal texture. This is the displacement texture. So let's change to the displacement texture. And now you can see we have that second material that's being rendered. And then if we actually go here and plug in that first material again, it will change what's being rendered in the viewport. And if we want to set it to the second material again, let's just plug in the second material. So that's all it is. We just created a duplicate of the shader, and we can now switch between the two different materials. So in order to blend between the two different shaders that we have here, we need to create a mix node. So press Shift A, left mouse button on search, and then type in mix, and then select the mix shader node. And this node allows you to blend between two different inputs and have a factor which specifies the factor that is used for blending the two different inputs. So let's go up here and plug in the output of the first shader into the mix shader. And let's move it down here and plug in the output of the second shader into the second shader input of the mix shader. And then plug the result of the mix shader node into the surface node. And then you can see the viewport will update and it's now blending halfway between shader 1 and shader 2. If I set this to 0, it will fully display material 1. If I set it to 1, it will fully display material 2. And here you can see I can just blend between the materials by using the slider. Now this is all cool, but we do want to blend, we do want to control the blend using vertex colors. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a new node. So Shift A, left click on search, and then type in Vertex Color. And this gives you a Vertex Color node. And we only want to use one channel to control the blending. So we need to separate the vertex colors into the R, G, and B channel. So let's get another node for that. Left click on search and then type in separate and select separate RGB. And then we're going to plug in the color into the image slot. And then we're going to plug in the result of the red channel into the factor of the mix shader. What that means is we can now control the blending using the red channel of the vertex colors that we paint on the mesh. Let's actually start painting some vertex colors. We can quickly do that by switching to paint mode or vertex paint mode up here. And then once you do that, you will see the texture change. So left click and you can see now the information in the second shader is fully being displayed on the mesh. The reason for that is by switching to vertex paint mode, we have just added a set of vertex colors to the object. If I remove that again, it goes back to the original layer. Now, in the shader, we have specified that we want to use the red color channel to blend between shader 1 and shader 2. And by adding vertex colors, we're flooding everything with white. And white is red 1, green 1, and blue 1. And as a result, it's fully displaying whatever is in the second slot of the mix shader. If I switch to solid viewport mode, I can actually show what's going on when painting. The controls for painting are pretty easy. You can press F and hold down F and use the left mouse button to change the radius. And you can use Shift F to change the strength. You can also use the sliders up here. So just however you want to do it, I recommend using the keyboard shortcuts because it's a little bit more intuitive. Up here, you can specify the color. So what we want to do is switch from HSV to RGB and then bring this down to green 0 and blue 0 because we only want to paint in the red channel. And now when we start painting using the left mouse button, you can see that we're filling the area with red. And the first thing we want to do is actually increase the radius and then fill everything with red and then bring the radius back down. And while painting, we can hold down Control to invert. So instead of red, it's painting black. And if I let go of Control, it's painting red again. If I switch to the rendered viewport mode, you can see that once I start painting and then once I hold down Control and start painting, I'm starting to reveal the second layer, or the first layer actually, because we are fully looking at the second layer by default. And then also I can use Shift F to change the strength. So if I do that, I can get a little bit of a softer blending. And in order to see this a little bit better, let me actually scroll out, switch back to object mode, select the light here, and then press Alt-G to center it at the 0, 0, 0 coordinates of our scene, and then press G to move it, and move it a little bit over here so that we're getting a little bit of a nicer result in the viewport. And then we can select the object again and go back to vertex paint mode, and then we can start painting these textures. And then depending on the strength, like right now the strength is really, really small, so it takes me a lot of clicks to actually paint in some color information. So let me increase that, and you can see now this is working a little bit better. So these are the basics for vertex painting. It's fairly simple stuff. I really like how Blender is handling it. What we want to do though is we want to use the height information in our displacement map to blend between the two different layers. And we also want to be able to specify a blend factor. So we want to be able to control how sharp our blending between the two different materials is. And in order to do that, we need to add some more nodes to our shader graph. So let's do that next. So next we want to add the height map to the blending process. And in order to do that, we need to add some math nodes. So Shift A and type in math to look for math nodes. And this one we're going to set to subtract. And then we're going to make 2 copies of this. So Control C, Control V, move that down, Control V again, move that over here. Let me select all of them and move them a bit out of the way. And then make a copy of that subtract node and set this one to divide. And this will all make sense in a little bit. And then we also need a mix RGB node. So plug that in. And then we're going to group all of these. So left click and drag to select them, and then Control G to group and make a node group. And let's connect the color out to the group output, and then go to node up here, and then change the interface. So we want to have 3 inputs, one for the blend mask, one for the height map, and one for the fall off. So click on +3 times, and then the first one is going to be blend mask. That's going to be the result of the vertex colors. Second one is going to be a height map node. And then the third one is just going to be fall off. And for the output, let's add another one as well. And call that one mask, because that's the result. And let's actually get rid of this one up here. So let's plug that. Let's remove that. Let's plug the color into the mask, and let's just delete the color output. And then all we need to do is change some settings here and connect these up. So this is just a math that drives the blending that we're going to set up now. So the blend mask is going to go into this slot, but it's also going to go into the first slot down here, and then we want to set the value on this subtract node to 1. And the fall off is going to go into the value here. And then the height map is just going to go into the value up here. And then this result is going to be dragged in here. This result is going to be dragged in here. This is going to go here. This is going to go to the color one. Looks like that one didn't connect, so let's do that again. And then what we're going to do is make sure that this is set to 0.735. And let's check all of our nodes. Right now the mixing algorithm is set to mix. We want to set this to add. And yeah, this is subtract, this is divide, this is subtract. The value here is 1. So yeah, we should be good on that. So let's just go out of the group by pressing this icon up here. And then you can see here's our node group with the different inputs and our mask output. And let's make some space here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put the node group before the mix shader, simply because we want to use the node group to drive the factor. So the height or the blend mask is the result of the red channel. So let's feed that in and drag that out. The height map is actually the displacement texture. So let's feed that into the height map slot. Make sure to drag it directly from the texture and not from the separate RGB. And then the fall off is just a value that we are going to manually set. And then another thing we need to do is we need a ramp node. So look for color ramp. And what we're going to do is we're going to plug the mask into the color ramp, which means it's going to take the output of the mask and it's going to color it from black to white. And then we're going to feed that result into the factor of the mix shader. And once we do that, we should get a result in the viewport. And if we now change the fall off value, you can see that we can now change the blending from, let's try 0.1, which is pretty harsh, or we can try 0.7, which is pretty soft. So let's try 0.05. And we can use our vertex colors to blend, and we can also change the strength, and then we can get some harder or some softer blending. And if you want to change the look of the blend in general, you can also play with these values in the color ramp here. So let's actually switch the fall off to something like 0.5 and then start playing with these values. And as you can see, it's another way to just like influence the look of the blending if you need to. We could have added this color ramp within the node group so that it's part of the node group and we don't have it exposed, but I like having it exposed because it gives you a quick way to just change the values or even just flip the texture. So if you want to invert the displacement map, you can just invert these values and now it's basically flipping which layer is on top, which is sometimes useful. So that's why I like to have it exposed. So that's basically it. We do have our blending setup. It's pretty cool. It works like in most of the other game engines that you can be familiar with, like Unreal allows you to do setups like this, Unity allows you to do setups like this, and obviously you can get a lot more elaborate with all of this. Now that we have the base blending working, the next thing that we need to look into is doing our displacement blending as well. So just like we did with two different shaders, we also need to blend the displacement maps together. Now, before we do that, I want to show you some quick tips. And since we activated the Node Wrangler add-on, we can always preview a node in the viewport by Control-Shift left-clicking on the node. So if I Control-Shift and left-click on the displacement node here, I can see the result in the viewport. If I click on the normal node, I can see the result of the normal node in the viewport. If I click on the albedo node, I can see the albedo map. And if I click on the color ramp node, I can see the result of the color ramp node. So that's a quick way to preview things. If you want to go back to your original result, just delete that viewer node and plug the shader back into the surface material output. So let's blend the displacement maps together. This is displacement map 1, so let's move that down here. And this is displacement map 2. Let's move that over as well. And then we're going to use a mix RGB because we're blending two color maps together and not two shaders. So Shift A, look for mix RGB. And then we're going to do factor 1 and factor 2. And for the factor, so for the blending, we want to use the result of the color ramp, which is our blend mask, if you remember correctly. And then what we're going to do is we're going to plug the result of the color map into the displacement slot. And as you can see, nothing has really changed. And that's because we're still in the Evee, we're still using the Evee render engine. So let's switch that back to cycles. And we should be getting some displacement. Yep. And we do need more subdivisions on the geometry to get proper displacement. So add a subdivision surface modifier and crank up the viewport levels to 4. And now you can see we're getting some really nice displacement here. And we can still modify the fall-off value, for example. We can go in here and paint on our mesh. Let's crank up the strength. And as you can see, it's taking quite a bit of time to update now. And that's because we're working with pretty dense geometry because of the subdivision modifier that's on our geo. We can also change the scale of the two displacement maps. So we can set this 2.2, for example, and this one 2.2. And now it's just more intense. Or you can have different values as well. So if you want to have 0.3 for the first layer and less for the second layer, you can do that as well. And as you can see, it's really powerful. Like this texture is actually really nice and displaces really nicely. One last thing we need to do to get the best quality in the viewport, go to material settings. And then we are going to go into the displacement slot. And then in here, under displacement, so in the settings category, you want to make sure that displacement is set to displacement and bump. That means that you're using both geometry displacement and the normal map. If this is set to bump only, you can see we're only getting the normal map. If it's set to displacement only, we're only getting the geometry deformation. If we set it to displacement and bump, we're getting the information from both passes. So this is giving you the best result in the viewport. So to tweak the quality of the rendering just a little bit more, one thing we can do is go back to object mode And then if we take a closer look, you can see we're getting some faceting here on the meshes. And that's because our original object is not set to shade smooth. So right click on the object and then just turn on shade smooth. And once you do that, you can see the faceting goes away. Also, let's go to the modifier tab and set the deformation to simple so that we don't lose the definition of the mesh in the corners. Next thing we want to do is load in a HDRI background image so that we are getting some better lighting. So switch in the shader editor from object to world. And then in here, type Shift A, look for search, and bring in an environment texture. And nothing has changed yet because we haven't loaded a texture and plugged it into HDRI background yet. One good resource for HDRI images is hdrihaven.com. So in here you can download any of these textures and then plug them into your scene. So let's do that. I'm going to click on Open and navigate to the directory where I have downloaded my HDRI image into, and then select the image that I want to use and then plug that into the color slot of the background node. And then once I do that, it's going to take a second to calculate, and then now you can see it's using the HDRI image to light our scene. Also, the HDRI is now showing up in the background. If you don't want that, just go to your render properties, go to film down here, and then set it to transparent. And now we can tweak the intensity of the HDRI image. So just go in here, and if we set this to like a low value, like 0.5 or something, you can see that the HDRI image is now not contributing as much to the scene anymore. Obviously, you can still tweak the light. So if you select the light in your outliner, and then, for example, reduce the intensity of the light to like 500, and then maybe up the intensity of the HDRI image, you can kind of like tweak the look of your scene. I'm going to go back to what I had previously, set this to 1000 and 0.25. And then let's also switch back the render engine to Evee again, so that you can see that the HDRI image is influencing the object in here too. So just give it a second to change, and once it has changed, we can now see the HDRI image influencing the lighting in Evee as well. If we set it to 0, there's no influence, and then the more we increase the strength, the more the HDRI image is contributing. So pretty easy to control. There's also more settings that you can access specifically in Evee. So over here you can turn on a bunch of post-processing like ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space reflections, motion blur, all that good stuff. Ambient occlusion won't do much right now because we don't have any geometry that can actually influence one another. So let's just add a cube, kind of like scale that down. And if we now turn on ambient occlusion, we're getting a little bit of contact ambient occlusion down here, but we need to play with the values. So let's maybe increase the factor and also increase the distance. And now you can see we're getting something here. So basically, if you would have more objects in your scene, this would be even more visible. So let me just exaggerate what's going on. But yeah, there you go. If I get rid of this cube, obviously we don't have any ambient occlusion at all. Let's turn this back off. And then one last thing, just if you wanted to make the surface look a little bit more interesting, what you could do is just switch to, select the object and switch to sculpt mode, and then turn off symmetry up here. And then you can use the same controls as for vertex color painting to like change the shape of your plane and make it look a little bit more interesting. So all good stuff. Let's take a look at one last thing. Let's go back to object mode. Now, if you wanted to change the tiling of the textures, so let's say you want the first layer to tile twice in comparison to the first layer, to the second layer, you can go into your node network. And then remember, here is the texture coordinate node, and then here's the mapping node. And in the mapping node, in the scale, you can actually change the scaling of the texture. So if you want this to tile twice, you can just set this to 2, 2, and 2. And now you can see it's actually half the resolution than it was before. So if we switch this back to 1, it becomes sharper. And then if we switch this to like 0.5, you can see it is now tiling twice. And then that's basically how you can control the tiling of the different channels. So 1, 1, and 1 is the default. And then if you reduce the scale, then it tiles more. If you increase the scale, it tiles less. And the same is true for the second layer. So if you wanted to influence that, you could just do it down here, set this to like 0.25. And now you can see this is tiling a lot more than the first layer. And because these nodes are all set up correctly, we can switch back to cycles if we wanted to. And we're getting displacement that is respecting the change in the mapping as well. So yeah, all good stuff. That's how you can control the tiling. And then there's a ton of more things you could do in here. You could have a third layer by just copying that layout and then just adding another mix shader and then mixing that in with the original layers that we had. Pretty much possibilities are endless here. Blender's shader editor is really powerful. But this is just a basic setup that allows you to do material blending directly in the viewport of Blender. And you can basically preview your mesh a little bit better by having a setup like this, especially if you want to use vertex blending in the game engine. So if we export this to Unreal, this is just a really cool way to preview what it's going to look like in Unreal. So we're almost at the end of the tutorial now. In order for you to not have to set up this whole shader graph from scratch every time you want to create a material, you can go to my Gumroad and get the source file for this for free. And what you're going to do is you're just going to make a new scene and then append the shader from that Blender file into that new scene to be able to use it. One thing I want to make you guys aware of before I show you how to do that is that each of these texture maps that we're using has a color space. So you can see down here it says sRGB for the albedo map and then none color for everything else. So this is important because the file that I'm going to give you will not include the Quixel textures. Obviously they belong to Quixel and I can't just add them to the tutorial. So if you want to use them in Unreal, you can just make a Quixel account and download them and use them in Unreal. If you want to use them for your personal projects, you are going to have to end up buying points and purchasing them for yourself. But basically, you're going to get a node setup that does not contain any of the textures. And when you bring in those textures, you have to make sure that the color space is set to the correct setting. So everything but albedo needs to be set to none color. And then the albedo texture needs to be set to sRGB. Just keep that in mind. So sRGB for albedo, none color for AO, none color for roughness, none color for normal, none color for displacement. So let's show you how to append the material into your file. So this is a brand new Blender file. And what you're going to do is you're going to click on File, Append, and then you're going to navigate to the directory where you have downloaded the Blender file that comes with the tutorial. It's called 2-layer blend. And then you just double click on it. And then in here, you can now see the scene collection or the outliner. You can see everything that's in the file. And then you just navigate to materials. And what you want to do is you want to append the blend shader. So double click on that. And now that you've done that, you can see that we can choose the blend shader over here. So let's just do that, which will assign the blend shader to the object. And then we can add another screen and switch this to shader editor. And I'm going to give you a quick rundown. I've spent some time kind of like organizing things a little bit. Over here, you have your UV tiling control where you can change the scale of the tiling. And then here are the textures themselves. So here you're going to plug in your texture maps by just opening them or adding them. And again, make sure to set it to the correct color space like I've just talked about. And you have to do this for both layers. And then you have your ambient occlusion intensity for layer 1, your normal intensity for layer 1, your AO intensity for layer 2, normal intensity for layer 2. And then the blending setup is here. So if you just want to use this part of the shader, you can copy that and bring it into your shader. And then we have the displacement amount that you can control down here. And then all of that feeds into the material output. So pretty simple setup. Feel free to use it, and I hope it's useful for you. Thanks for watching and have a good rest of your day.